Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, Unleashing the Texas Energy Renaissance, How a Growing Consensus for Climate Action Can Benefit Texas. This event is hosted by republicEn and Citizens Climate Lobby Texas. My name is Wen Lee. I'm the Engagement Director at republicEn, and I'm so glad that you have all joined us today. Here is a very brief outline of what's happening today. We're going to start off with a short welcome and a basic overview. And then after that, we'll jump into our special presentation by our guest, Shannon Caraway. And then we'll have plenty of time for you all to ask questions. I'm sure we're all Zoom experts at this point, but just as a reminder, there is a chat feature, which we encourage you all to use. So just right here, if you can find the chat box, I'll say hi. So you should see a flashing notification, and if you click on it, it opens the chat. And this is where we would love for you to submit any questions you have today, to write comments and interact with one another. And this is the way that we'll be able to communicate. Just to warm up the chat box, let's just go ahead, if you wouldn't mind, share where you're joining us today. Put in your city and your state. Let us know where you're at. I will participate too. I am in Pasadena, California. So please let us know where you're joining from. We've got lots of Texans, of course, fantastic, but also I see Massachusetts, and I saw someone from Oklahoma. Excellent. Good. Welcome, everyone. It's so lovely to see people from all over Texas and all over the country as well. Texas is a big topic for the whole country, and this is something that everyone should learn more about, not just Texans, of course. All right, so as you're listening to today's presentation, at any time you can submit a question through the chat. Make sure that you send the chat, your question to everyone. Price Atkinson, who is on republicEn's team, he's going to be collecting all the questions. And then at the end, during the Q&A, we're going to go through as many of them as possible. So please submit your questions through the chat. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, this webinar is hosted by republicEn, as well as Citizens Climate Lobby, Texas. And you might be wondering who republicEn is if you're not familiar with us. We're a nonprofit organization for conservatives who want to solve climate change through common sense market solutions. We call our growing movement the EcoRight. Citizens Climate Lobby, also known as CCL, is building support in Congress for a national bipartisan climate solution. After this event, I hope you'll learn more about republicEn and CCL, and I'd like to ask you to consider getting involved with both organizations. I'd also like to give special thanks to Susan Adams and Larry Howe at CCL for helping to make this webinar possible. We on the republicEn team are delighted to be co-hosting this event with you all. Okay, so at this time, I'd like to pass the mic over to former Congressman and republicEn's Executive Director, Bob Inglis, who's just going to say a few words.
Yes, a few words of welcome to thank you all for joining us, and to especially thank our friends at CCL for sponsoring this with us. I heard Shannon Caraway give this presentation several weeks ago, and you are in for a real treat because, as Wynn just said, Texas is important, not just in Texas, but to the whole country and really to the world. And so what you're about to hear is a presentation from somebody with deep knowledge of the energy business, and who can maybe shed some interesting light on what might be ahead for Texas. So we're very glad you joined us, and excited about what we're going to find out here today. So thanks for being here.
Thanks, Bob. All right, so let's see here. I'm going to just briefly introduce our guest and then have him take the microphone. Shannon Caraway is our speaker today. He's been actively involved for over 3 decades in the energy business. He spent the first 13 years of his career working at what is currently known as Encore, the next 16 years working at TXU Energy or Luminant Energy, and the past 4.5 years leading the business development efforts for Solar Prime. Shannon holds bachelor's and master's degrees in electrical engineering with a focus in power engineering, as well as an MBA. He is also a registered professional engineer in the state of Texas. Shannon currently volunteers with Citizens Climate Lobby and serves on an industry advisory board for the electrical engineering department at the University of Texas at Arlington. Without further ado, I'll now turn the floor over to Shannon Caraway. Take it away, Shannon.
Thank you, Wynn. Let's see if I can get the screen share working here. Great. Thank you for taking some time to listen today to this presentation I've put together. And it's one that I've titled Unleashing the Texas Energy Renaissance, How a Growing Consensus for Climate Action Can Actually Benefit Texas. I'm excited to get to share it with you today. I wanted to start out with some polling that was conducted in May of 2019 by Luntz Global. And we're going to look at two aspects of that poll. Number one, they found that the vast majority of American voters think that it's important that any national climate solution be bipartisan. Whether you're looking at that from a Republican or a Democrat or swing voter perspective, it's a real tight band between 75 and 83%. And so this is something that bipartisanship is really what Americans want to see. Another interesting aspect of this polling is they found that voters support, and really rather strongly support, a carbon fee with dividends. We see that 2 out of 3 voters in the country support that. And with Democrats, it's 4 out of 5 voters. With swing voters, it's approximately 2 out of 3 voters. And even among Republicans, it has majority support at 53%. But one of the really interesting things that Luntz Global found is that when you drill into that and look at Republicans under 40, which is where the growing part of the base is, it actually, they found that 75% supported a carbon fee with dividends, which is actually really close to what you see among Democrats. So the growing part of the Republican Party is actually strongly supportive of this, which was quite an interesting finding. So let's try to take a look at what I've called the 4 pillars of the carbon dividend approach. Number 1 is a gradually rising carbon fee that begins to price carbon emissions. Number 2 is a carbon dividend back to all Americans. This is what maintains the revenue neutrality and protects our citizens from not experiencing net higher energy costs. Number 3 is the border carbon adjustment. And I'm going to take a little more time to explain it and number 4 here because I think they're critical. The border carbon adjustment is what keeps us from just shipping jobs overseas as we would implement something like this. So what you see is that imports into the border are assessed a fee based on their carbon intensity, just like if the goods were produced in the US. And similarly, when they are exported, they get a refund at the border based on their carbon intensity so they can go and compete on the global stage, just as they do today. Let's try to illustrate that with something that'll be a little more what we're going to look at here in a moment. Let's think of imported oil to the US. It would be assessed a fee based on its carbon intensity at the border, just as it had been produced in say the Permian Basin. Conversely, if that oil in the Permian Basin was exported out of the US, it would receive a refund at the border of the fee that had been assessed back at the production side, so that it goes and competes on a global base competitiveness level, just as it does today. So that's a really important part of this. The 4th part is a significant regulatory simplification. What we're focused on with the carbon fee and dividends is basically allowing the market to solve our climate emissions challenges that we're trying to solve, rather than doing that with command and control EPA measures. So that's a very important part. And these are the 4 pillars of a carbon dividends approach. When we try to take a look at where is the strong industry support for this, it's actually quite strong across a number of sectors. Coming from the energy profession myself, one of the things that I take note of is that 4 of the 5 oil and gas super majors in the world are strong supporters of carbon dividends. It's you see that ExxonMobil, BP, Total, Shell, quite significant supporters. And then coming from the electricity industry, I take note of that 3 of the 4 largest national merchant generation and retail companies are also founding members of this. Vista Energy, Exxon rather, and Calpine. And then we see there's strong Fortune 500 company support, as well as a number of conservancy agencies. We also see that 4 out of 5 living Fed chairs among economists have endorsed this approach. There's very strong economist support for it just because of how economically efficient this approach is, rather than a command and control approach to try to solve our climate emissions. So let's begin to think about how carbon fee impacts the energy mix, because it clearly has to have an impact if it's going to be making a difference. The first place, and maybe one of the largest places that we see it has an impact, is in the existing electric generation space. Coal emits 2.5 times the CO2 of a natural gas-fired combined cycle combustion turbine on a megawatt hour per megawatt hour basis. What we see is then, as you begin to assess a fee on it, especially when coal emits 2.5 times as much, it quickly accelerates the retirement of the remaining coal-fired generation in the US. As a result, natural gas generation will ramp up significantly. Nuclear is retained because of its no carbon component, begins to get rewarded for that. In the oil and gas sector, we see demand for lower CO2 oil will begin to surge. So while total demand may decrease, low CO2 oil surges demand. And then natural gas demand surges as coal retires for the reasons I outlined above. And then in the renewables and electric transport space, we see solar, wind, energy storage begin to accelerate as well, and electrification of transportation. Okay, so let's begin to unpack a couple of those components and look at them more closely. First, I want to take a look at the CO2 intensity of different oil reservoirs around the, on a global basis. What we see in the third column is the global average intensity of commercializing oil is in the 14% range. So you see that here. And then we see, as we look at it, it ranges from a low of 8% intensity in Norway to a high of 43% intensity in the oil sands. So think of that. There's more than a 5-to-1 differential between the lowest and highest reservoirs here. But the things I take note of is that the US Gulf of Mexico, of which Texas has a large contribution to, and the ideal Permian Basin, which is such a prolific play in West Texas, are it's the second and third lowest CO2 intensity oil reservoirs that we see on a global basis, according to this data that we were looking at here. So the thing I think about out of all this is, while global demand likely will decrease as you begin to place a price on carbon emissions due to the fee, low CO2 demand oil will begin to increase. And since not all oil is created the same, as we're seeing here from a CO2 intensity standpoint, the US actually enjoys an advantage, and more specifically, Texas enjoys a significant advantage because we have lower than the global average CO2 intensity oil. Okay, let's drill in a little deeper to the coal to natural gas demand increase that I referenced earlier. One of the ways I like to do this is let's take a price of say $35 a ton for CO2, and let's flow that through and see what its impact is for the generation technologies, because coal is principally used in in electric generation. So we see that a coal-fired, if for a $35 a ton CO2 fee, coal-fired power generation cost increase about $35 a megawatt hour. Natural gas fired combined cycle combustion turbine power generation cost would increase about $13 a megawatt hour. Today, these two technologies on a dispatch level compete head to head. And so as soon as you price the carbon emissions, it actually creates a net $22 megawatt hour advantage for natural gas versus coal-fired power generation. And that leads to an acceleration, a significant acceleration and retirement of the remaining coal-fired generation in the US. As that occurs, that actually creates a surge in demand for natural gas. And the way that it does that is the US natural gas generation fleet has about a 50% capacity factor as we sit here today on a national average. So as coal retires, there's room for that natural gas generation that's already built to flex up and provide a lot more power generation than it does today, which creates significantly more natural gas demand, as well as we could see some increase in natural gas generation construction. But what we see is a nationwide natural gas demand increase opportunity in the 15 to 20% range that comes from this coal to natural gas switching. Something that's important to me, especially as I've made transitions in my career, more from a coal-based employment to sector and generation to solar development, and I've had to do that through more of a forced transition, is I think about it from a total employment standpoint and look at the job impacts that come from that. So what I've pulled together here for you is allows us to see employment. If we look at this second column, in the power generation employment in the US is about 800,000 jobs. There's about another 182,000 jobs that provide the fuel for that power generation, which allows us to take a more holistic look in the total jobs in the fuel production and power generation in the electricity sector. There's about 981,000 jobs in that space. And then when we take that and divide it by the annual production in gigawatt hours, we're able then to create a metric in jobs per gigawatt hour. What you find is there's about just under 0.25 jobs per gigawatt hour on a national basis. But as we think about the transition I talked about a moment ago from coal to natural gas, we find that that piece all by itself becomes a net job creator on a national basis because of this 0.155 being lower, or the 0.179 being higher than the 0.155. And that's just if all transition was coal to natural gas. Some of it will be made up by renewables, where we see is even higher employment at 0.663 jobs per gigawatt hour. Now, if you're like me, you're wondering, how could renewables be such a high jobs per gigawatt hour? One of the things is this is made up of a large component of rooftop solar, which actually has quite a few jobs, a lot of jobs for the amount of energy production. But if we thought of this even on a utility scale basis, this would be like 0.24 or so jobs per gigawatt hour. So we see that when we put all this together, while that there's clearly a pain in transition of 150 or so thousand coal jobs in the US, it's a net growth opportunity across the country. And this is at a national level. But if you think about what, and we're going to look at it more in a moment, when we think about it at a Texas level, it's even more of an opportunity because we're going to see that significantly less of the coal employment, especially on the fuel side, is in Texas, whereas we're heavily levered to the opportunity upsides in oil, natural gas, and renewables. Okay, so let's begin also to try to bring this back and think about what is the climate impacts that we see from this? Because it's, I focused on a lot of the economic opportunity, and it's really what excites me for Texas. But at its core, something that excites me a lot is what this does for us from a emission reduction standpoint and being able to meet our Paris climate commitments. So to help us understand that, let's think about coal emissions, CO2 emissions of coal versus natural gas power plants. Natural gas fired generation on a national fleet level emits about 0.42 metric tons of CO2 per megawatt hour. Coal generation on a national level is about 1 metric ton of CO2 per megawatt hour. So if we took 2019, used EIA actual emissions data, and we replaced the remaining coal in the US generation with natural gas. So we did that flex up in capacity factor that I talked about. And so I think of this as the most conservative reduction we could see because it's purely coal to natural gas with no renewable increase. We would see 570 million metric tons of reduction in CO2 emissions just using these metrics up above. So if we go look at our Paris climate commitments, it was a 26 to 28% reduction from a 2005 baseline. And we can go look at EIA actual information to see that that 2005 baseline was 59.99 million metric tons. By 2019, our actual CO2 emissions, again, as reported by EIA, was 51.31 million metric tons. So already a 14.5% reduction. That reduction has principally occurred from the fracking technology getting dramatically better and driving down the cost of natural gas by roughly 2/3 over a 12 to 13 year period. And then the dramatic reduction in cost that we've seen in wind and solar, driving those costs down by 2/3 to 90% over the last 10 to 12 years as well. All of that put together and a number of other factors has allowed us to already see, we're already more than halfway there. If we took these 2019 actuals and factored in this potential 570 million metric ton reduction that I just spoke of, we would be down to 45.61 million metric tons, which would put us at a 24% reduction from the 2005 baseline. This remaining 2 to 4% would need to come from additional wind and solar build. And being somebody that's very active in that space, I see that is definitely possible, especially if we get this implemented soon. All right, let's begin to kind of tie this together and put a bow around it from a Texas perspective. And you're about to see why I've titled this presentation, Unleashing the Texas Energy Renaissance. We've talked about earlier how demand increase for low CO2 oil is such a big opportunity. Texas is the #1 oil producer with onshore production of 41% of the total US production. If we factored in our share of the Gulf of Mexico production, it would put us up at like a little over 48% of total US production. Nearly half of all the oil in the country is coming out of Texas and its share of the Gulf of Mexico. And we saw earlier that it is some of the lowest CO2 oil in the world. Texas is the #1 producer of natural gas at 25% of total US production. And we've just seen the opportunity for a 20 to 25% demand increase. Texas is heavily levered to benefit from that. On the renewable side, Texas is the #1 wind producer at 25% of US wind production is in Texas. And then something that's been happening recently, and you may not even know, is Texas is the fastest growing solar market in the country. It's outpacing California and Florida in 2020 in solar growth. And this is principally as utility scale solar has become highly economic in Texas. Okay, so these are the 4 drivers where Texas is heavily levered to benefit. We've talked about how coal is what really gets priced out of the market as we begin to price emissions or CO2 emissions. So let's look at Texas from that standpoint. Texas is only number 9 in coal mining at 3.3% of US production. And 63% of Texas coal consumption is actually imported from out of state. So it's imported coal to Texas, and it's railed in from Wyoming, who happens to be the number 1 coal producing state in the country at 41%. So what the opportunity that's in front of us is, as we begin to price carbon emissions, it actually will employ more Texans powering Texas, and employ more Texans in powering the whole rest of the country and the rest of the world with our low and no CO2 fuels. And this is such a significant opportunity that I think we just really need to wrap our mind around and see and think about. On the energy innovation and economic development front, let me touch on a couple things here. As we reward carbon-free energy innovation, we're going to see carbon capture and sequestration incentivized. Existing nuclear generation is retained because it begins to get compensated for its zero carbon components and may grow again. Solar and wind are rewarded and will grow as a result. On the rural economic development front, I grew up in a rural community myself in West Texas. Oil and natural gas production jobs and the tax revenue they bring is retained, as well as we see huge growth opportunities. Utility scale solar and wind growth brings stable jobs and tax revenues to these rural communities. And then another component of this is electric transport and energy storage revolution. I'm sure all of you have seen in the news Tesla's new Gigafactory near Austin that's set to be creating between 10 and 15,000 direct and indirect new jobs. It's going to be their largest Gigafactory in the world at over 2,200 acre complex. It's going to be building the Cybertruck, the Semi, the Model 3, the Model Y, battery cell production. Texas is quickly, between Tesla and a number of other companies that are already here and moving here, heavily levered to benefit in that space as well. On the business side, let's take a look at that. Texas-based support for carbon dividends, as we saw earlier with the slides showing us corporate support for this globally or worldwide. We see Vistra Corporation, largest U.S. merchant generator and retailer in the country, headquartered here in Texas. They're a strong supporter of this. Their CEO is an outspoken supporter of carbon dividends. ExxonMobil, the largest oil and gas super major in the country, strong supporter for over a decade. And then more recently, we're seeing a growing national support among a number of other entities, business entities around the country. In September, we saw the Business Roundtable come out in support. U.S. Chamber of Commerce came out in support in late January. Early February, the Electric Power Supply Association came out in support for carbon pricing. And then really only a couple of weeks ago, a big announcement in the news, the American Petroleum Institute has also endorsed carbon pricing. So we're seeing a swell of support among our large businesses. So why should Texans, let's begin to wrap this up. Why should Texans support carbon dividends? Well, number one, it's a solution that increases natural gas and low carbon oil demand. And that creates more clean energy jobs in Texas. Number two, it's market-based approach that significantly reduces government regulation to accomplish this transition. Number three, it pressures China to cut their carbon emissions or face higher prices for their exports sold into the US. And number four, the dividend will offset the higher energy prices, keeping it revenue neutral. Texas is blessed with abundant sources of low and no carbon energy, and the carbon dividends proposal creates the proper economic signals that stand to unleash this Texas energy renaissance that I'm speaking of. All right, with that, I'm going to pause here and see if we have any questions that's come in. Wynn?
Great. Thanks, Shannon. Yeah, we'll leave your screen up for a bit if people want to write down your contact info. And then after that, maybe we'll take it down so we can see each other's faces better. But leave it up for maybe the first couple questions.
And I may leave it up also just in case it's helpful in answering some people's questions.
Oh, that's true. Good point. Because you might want to reference some slides. All right. Very good point. All right. So thank you, Price, for collecting questions that have been coming in so far. We're just going to get through as many as we can. We might not be able to get through all of them, but if you do have a question, please please go ahead and enter it now into the chat and make sure it's sent to everyone so that Price can see it. So the first question I have comes from Charles in Norman, Oklahoma. Shannon, the question is, would methane emissions and leaks be accounted for in the carbon fee system? If not, I would be concerned about an increase in natural gas demand since methane is a potent greenhouse gas.
That's an excellent, both excellent question and excellent point. Regulations around methane emissions need to continue and be handled outside of this. And in many of the proposals that I've seen, they are, because you're right. It is roughly something like 80 times more potent in its contribution to as a greenhouse gas. Something else to think about, though, in that is it's easy to focus on the methane emissions on natural gas and be not aware or not focus on the coal that you're replacing. Coal mining itself has methane emissions associated with it. I mean, look up coal bed methane. I mean, you always need to think of both sides of this when you're thinking of this type of transition and impact, but all legitimate proposals I'm seeing realize a continued need for methane regulation that needs to increase from where we are today. And that's an important component of this. So great question and a great point.
Great, thanks, Shannon. Next question is from Sid out in California. He asks, which fossil fuel has the highest BTU rating, coal or natural gas? And how does this affect our calculations?
Well, think of it this way. Rather than think of it from BTUs, just think of it all in dollars. Say, let's take electricity. Electricity is where, frankly, the electric sector is where the vast majority of the price substitution is going to occur, because that's where coal is used, right? Principally and foremost, if you go look at the EIA numbers around coal and its use, it's nearly all in power generation, or the vast, vast majority of it. So the economics that I shared with you earlier is how on a dollar per megawatt hour, the impact occurs. So for the $35 a ton that I spoke of, you see about a $35 a megawatt hour increase in coal-fired power generation cost. Whereas for natural gas generation, the combined cycle combustion turbine, it was like a $13 increase for a net $22 megawatt hour substitution. So that's the right way to think about how that economic substitution occurs, is in dollars per megawatt hour based on that CO2 fee. And that's what you'll see.
Great, thank you. Next question is from Hans in Texas. I have seen articles online where Saudi Arabia touts themselves as the lowest overall carbon, having the lowest overall carbon intensity oil of any major producing country. Comments?
You know, I think the comments I'd have, and let's go back to this slide here. Clearly, not every reserve in the entire globe is on here, but the global average of 14% is. And, you know, some of the countries in the Middle East are on here. Saudi Arabia specifically is not. But what we see is the US Gulf of Mexico and the ideal Permian are at lower CO2 intensities than the global average. So already we're ahead of the average. But certainly as you price out the higher CO2 intensity, as you price carbon emissions, the decreases are going to come from the high CO2 emitters, creating net increase in demand for low CO2 oil. So does Saudi Arabia also benefit based on what the data that Hans is sharing? Quite potentially, if that's true. But our whole goal out of this is to reduce CO2 emissions, not necessarily is it around picking winners and losers of individual countries. We just happen to be a country that would be a net beneficiary of this based on the data we see here.
Thank you. Okay, Judith from Houston asks, I've read that renewable jobs will be lower paying. How do you respond to this argument?
I think one of the things to think about out of that, there's a lot of anecdotes out there, and there's a lot of things that can get shared. I have my own personal story as I've transitioned out of a power generation base that was, a large part of my career that was pretty heavily coal based. Now there was some natural gas and renewables in there, in nuclear, but we were dominantly coal. Is that company really began to grapple with that, and that's Vistra Corporation as they're known today. There was a point in 2016 that they laid off half the company. So I was one of, we went from 4,200 people at the beginning of that year to 2,100 at the end. And I transitioned out at that time, along with many of my coworkers. I have found as I got and joined the renewable generation development sector, most of those skills, they're the same skills you need over here. Most of and frankly, from a compensation standpoint, I have found it to be one where it's equally rewarding here, both in personal satisfaction and compensation. And I find by and large, most people I know at a utility scale level are making the transitions, they're similar paying jobs. Is there a story that can be created somewhere about their lower paying compared to something? Possibly, maybe so. But my own personal experience hasn't been borne out. And I wouldn't get caught up in that. This transition is occurring. And what I'm showing you is that if we do it with a market-based approach, it is one that's a net creator of jobs. And it's one that if it's a net creator, market equilibrium will come up. And I suspect total pay actually isn't increasing from what we see today. Great question. Thanks for asking.
I'm going to sneak in my own question real quick before we go back to the audience. I know that you have given this presentation to State House officials and offices, and I'm just really curious, what kind of responses have you gotten from the Texas State House, and do folks there seem knowledgeable about all this? Is this all new to them? And have you gotten any positive responses to the ideas you proposed?
When that's a great question. What I think my sense of it is most people are surprised. They're quite surprised of the economic opportunity piece of it. I'll say that even being somebody that's worked in this industry this long, when I first started trying to look at this in 2017, when the Climate Leadership Council came out with their proposal, James Baker and George Schultz in February 17, I started to analyze all this myself and put it together. I personally was surprised by what I found. And what I have seen is I've sharing this with others. Most of the people I've had a chance to visit with and share this, they're surprised of the economic opportunity. And they see that it's quite economically rational that this is the benefit for Texas and frankly, for Louisiana and most of the Gulf Coast. So it's a surprised reaction, and I think it's one of the first times someone's put it together and shared it with them in that format. I do think more dialogue is needed around it for people to fully appreciate it and begin to take action around, okay, if this much of a benefit, why would we drag our feet any longer?
That's really fascinating. I'm so glad that you're doing that, and I'm surprised no one else is talking about it. To be honest. Okay, let's see. I'm going to go back to some more audience questions, but I know Bob also has a question. But Bob, I'm going to tee you up later. But we're going to go back to the audience first. So the next question is from Paul in Boston. He asks, how long could the increased natural gas capacity factor last? Through 2030 or 2040?
That's a great question. I don't have the slide in here on it. I included that in a presentation I gave last June in CCL's June conference. I used in that to put that together. I used the En-ROADS model, which I think many of you have heard of, and En-ROADS is spelled ENROADS. You can go look at. And I tried to mimic what I saw that pricing carbon would do under this proposal. And what I saw at that time is natural gas demand increases over the next decade. So let's say 2021 to 2031, or for a 10-year period. And then there's a slow decrease after that, such that at the end of 20 years, it's about like it is currently. And then really it begins to stabilize at that level nearly indefinitely. And I think I'm guessing the fundamental driver of that inside the model is carbon capture and sequestration, making that to be the outcome, though I can't know that for sure. So answering your question, over a 20-year period, it looks like it's an increase or the same or more than what we see today, and probably peaks about 10 years out.
Thanks. Let's see, next question is from Clyde, and he asks, why is Texas the major oil producing state in the country? Why isn't it Wyoming or Louisiana or any other state?
This is probably, there's probably 1,001 drivers of that. And I think most of it probably comes down to geology. It's just where God placed the oil in the first place. Is there some other components of it? Is there a regulatory component that makes it easier? Probably. Is there, a number of other factors, easier to do business here, that type of thing? Probably. Principally and foremost, though, I have to suppose that it's just where the resources are of the nature that we've talked about here. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Okay, we have a question from Gunnar in College Station. He asks, since wind and solar are already cheaper than natural gas, very likely so in Texas, how can you evaluate how utilities will choose between natural gas and renewables to replace coal?
It's a great question, Gunnar. Let me try to answer that a little bit. Again, taking a Texas company that's pretty outspoken in this area, or they have a CEO who's quite outspoken. Vistra Corporation, if you go and Google Kurt Morgan, Vistra Corp, in fact, I think late September of last year, if you look at their investor relations site on their website, they have a presentation of the transition they are making into solar and storage, coupled with coal plant retirements, and they try to lay out a multi-year period of 6, 8, 10 years. And they make the case of why they're doing that and the opportunity they see, which is quite significant. I think the important thing to think about is, it's not overnight that suddenly you've made a transition of this nature. All of it takes place over a time continuum. And an element of wind and solar you have to think about is their intermittent resources, whereas traditionally natural gas generation, coal are dispatchable resources. In other words, you can call on them when you want to, because the energy storage component of those resides back on the fuel side, either in the coal yard for the coal plant or the underground natural gas storage for the natural gas plant. For wind and solar, we see that energy storage component really needs to reside over on the electric side with battery storage, because they're intermittent. When they're available doesn't perfectly match when demand is occurring. So yes, they're lowering cost, and yes, they are displacing other technologies today, and they will continue to do so. But as they do, we will need to begin to factor in more energy storage cost as a part of that to effectively make more of a dispatchable renewables. And it's the combination of the dispatchability of renewables and the renewable itself that will compete over time with the dispatchability of fossil resources and make that transition become much deeper than it is where it is today. So that's a long answer, but I want to make sure you understand that one is fundamentally intermittent, the other one's dispatchable, and it's the combination of the intermittent resource plus its dispatchability that make that longer, deep-term transition. That's where that economic trade-off is happening. And I pointed you to one of the industry leaders to go see how they're thinking about it.
Thanks, Shannon. Bob Inglis, I'm going to give you a chance now. Do you have a question for Shannon that you wanted to ask?
Yeah, Shannon, you and I connected up about a year ago, I guess it was, right, as the coronavirus was starting. And I'm particularly interested. So we have yet actually to meet in person, which is by Zoom. But I know you're a person of faith, and my question is about acceptance of this message. I mean, if the folks at your church, folks in your family, folks in your community, these are the people that we really need to hear this message, right, and accept it. And some, particularly on the right, we're at republicEn.org, we're focused on obviously conservatives, and they really have had a little bit of trouble accepting this kind of message because, well, I don't know. What do you think? Why is that? Do you think it's just because it's new, or do you think that, gee, they didn't know, for example, that Texas could actually come out very well here? That's what's so exciting about what your presentation to me is. That, gee, Texas could come out very well. Is that what it is, or how do you think it is that we get greater acceptance on the right for this kind of innovation message that you're bringing?
Bob, that's a great question, and one I've thought about a lot. I'm going to confess something at first here, though, just to really try to relate to those who don't already accept this. I myself didn't really see this until as recently as about 4 years ago. In fact, if we went back a little further in time, say a decade ago, I actually, in private conversation, would openly mock, how would anybody want to pay 2x, for renewables, what they could get for conventional power generation? And I thought it made sense. And I think economically, it's easier to be in that spot where you're a little biased towards something when you think the economics are so non-compelling. If I was honest, I think I probably also had a personal bias because I was concerned about the impact for my own job. I mean, as a provider for my family, I had concerns about it. On the faith side, I think, that too is a pretty mixed space. I would say this. I'm going to start out with the positive because I'm a positive person. My own daughter, for her senior thesis in high school, she wrote something around caring for creation. And she, she's a graduate of Covenant Christian Academy here in Colleyville, Texas. And she looked at it from a faith component of, as stewards of God's creation, we should want to be caretakers of it. We should want to take care of it. And that's part of our role, which is, and she saw, came at it from that angle and talked about the need and the opportunity here. Yeah, so that's the most optimistic, kind of best case scenario. Yes, I find in my own circle, among the Christians I'm around, if I was guessing just an informal poll, maybe the majority don't see this positive message. And I think part of it is really coming from outdated economic assumptions is part of it, which is where I used to be. And if you're not in the industry, you don't see how fast this is happening. And I think in other parts of it is, frankly, some of the media we surround ourselves with can easily be an influence to us more than we realize it can be. And often they are working from outdated economic assumptions. Bob, honestly, it's something we need to do a better job with. And for me, I'm trying to handle it by being as open as I can be about it and talk about it with friends and family and others, mainly on the right, which is where, I share the same either faith or political background with, because it's a great opportunity for us and something we should all be optimistic about. And we've got more work to do. I think
yeah, it's so true. It's a great opportunity for us. It's a great opportunity for free enterprise, right? I mean, exactly. It's just this incredible opportunity for those of us on the right to prove that Milton Friedman was right, that the better way to do this rather than regulating is just price it. And then watch people in the liberty of enlightened self-interest pursue their self-interest. And in the process, because of accountability, clean up God's creation. And it's a total win. But I can also just make sure to identify with you. Remember, I spent 6 years in Congress saying that climate change was nonsense. That was my first 6 years there.
All right.
I was out 6. I came back for another 6 with a very different point of view. So we at republicEn.org are very accepting of people who are coming to see this, seeing the opportunity for free enterprise, seeing that really the country needs people like Shannon Caraway to present the solution that works. Because a lot of people got sentiment, but they don't have solutions.
Yeah.
You're the guy that knows the business and can show you a solution, which is pretty exciting.
Well, it was the smart people that came up with the solution. I just had the opportunity to look at it and say, wow, this is a pretty darn good idea. And begin to just kind of unpack it a little bit.
Great. Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Shannon. We do have a few more questions. Maybe I'll try to jam in 2 more. Okay. Paul in Georgetown asks, he says, currently there's a huge amount of natural gas flaring or vented in West Texas. Do you think this would be reduced or eliminated by adopting a carbon price?
That's a great question. I come back to this slide here, looking at this. And if you noticed, I talked about this ideal Permian versus Permian as when this was put together. And if you drill into the components, methane is, and flaring is really the big, flaring in particular is the big difference from one to the other. I take that to be principally oil production is what the producers were after, and the Permian is the principal driver. And it took quite a while for 3 large pipelines to get built out of the Permian Basin to bring gas out. And the last of those is just coming on. And so taken together, what was a lot of driving the flaring of natural gas earlier, because you had more production of natural gas locally than you had pipelines to get it out, has by and large been resolved. And now, rather than flare it, they're able to bring that to market and sell it which is both good for the environment and good for economics.
Rick in Kansas asked, have you looked at hydrogen as a longer duration energy storage?
I think that is one of many exciting potential opportunities for longer duration energy storage. And I think inevitably it will have some role to play. The way I think about this energy storage transition over on the electricity side, though, is it'll start with economically what's most economical for short duration. And then the deeper the transition out of traditional dispatchable resources we go, the longer the dispatchability of the storage needs to be. And that's when you will see technologies like that really begin to blossom the way you see battery energy storage, lithium-ion battery energy storage in most cases, really starting to blossom like it is today.
All right, and the last question we can fit in from Roger in Spring, Texas. What is your opinion of battery storage development to help renewables when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine?
Roger, I'm actually quite optimistic about it. I think it's the technology that is economically where it needs to be today, that the combination of battery energy storage for a 3 to 4 hour duration of withdrawal combined with utility scale solar, it's already meaningfully cheaper than a new, say, natural gas fired generator when you consider the cost of the generator, the pipeline cost, all of the all-in cost. So it's already cheaper than that new tech or replacement with natural gas generation for new generation. It's been cheaper for several years. Where it's becoming and very close to becoming is cheaper than existing natural gas generation in that area. And that's where, once you get to there, that's when you'll see even more significant growth on the S curve of adoption than where we are today. And we're really close to that point. Great question.
Super. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. Thanks for all your excellent questions. And we are going to wrap up now. I do want to let everyone know that we recorded this presentation and we will be sending out a link to the recording after this. And if you have any other questions or follow-up, please email me, respond to the email that you get. Huge thanks to Shannon for your time and your wisdom. I hope everyone learned a lot today. I sure did. And thanks to CCL for co-hosting this event with us. I hope everyone has a wonderful day.
All right, thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.